Today is August 7th, 2013 at 10:45 a.m. and we're sitting with Dan Davidson.
So to start, if you don't mind telling us how you got involved with the museum, you can go from there.
I did it in about 91 or so it was 1991, that I had gotten out of college. And so basically we were doing, because my degree is actually in ministry, it's not in history. You guys are going to find out a lot of things you don't know. but it is part of the story. So the church, which is the building at the time, was catty-cornered from here, where the Center Craig is at now, was having like their 90th anniversary. And I had been addicted, I suppose, not addicted, but interested in history for my whole life. It was my best class in school and a lot of different things. So had gotten done with college and come up, and we were trying to do a 90th anniversary thing a little bit for church, and got involved, showed up at the museum, and its main workroom was in the old courthouse main level. And the table that you're sitting on in that workroom, that long oak table, was the workroom table in the old museum. And it actually, this is going to go a long ways around the barn, it actually was the first commissioner's table for Moffat County. So anyway, it had gotten relegated to the museum. And that's where a lot of our furniture over here came from. The old stuff was original courthouse furniture.
Okay.
But anyway, there was Louise Miller was the director of volunteers that she insisted on being called. And so I was looking for pictures of charter members and some other things, and that just sort of got me started in that time frame, 91 or 2. And you know what? I gave you the wrong date, so you'll get to change that. So the date was 81.
81.
I was 10 years off.
Okay. So 81, you were
81 is when I was looking for the history of the church. So it was there, and that's what happens with minds, I guess. So anyway, 81. And so she helped me look for pictures, and I had known her a long time, because as a kid, I worked at City Market in high school as a carry-out.
Okay.
And she would be the one that was headed to the museum with all sorts of stuff. And we had some discussions, and she knew my family forever as well. Anyway, we got started on that, and then gradually that sort of opened up to where I ended up at a period in time on the board, which the museum board is a group of people that are appointed by the county commissioners.
Right.
And there's it's varied at different times, but they're an advisory board, and they've met at different times too, but at the most sometimes quarterly. But Louise Miller was the paid volunteer, and she only worked like half a day a week.
Mm-hmm.
And she had come up with a couple of other people that worked part-time. Alice Robinson was the retired Chamber of Commerce director. Wilma Cosgriff had retired and was friends with Louise as well, and next-door neighbors with her, Louise's mother. And she had been the lady that the Cosgriff Hotel, she and her husband had come, and I might tell some stories about Wilma later, had come to Craig and started the Cosgriff. But she had worked and retired from C&H Distributing, which is the Coors distributor in Craig. But anyway, she took up time working at the museum and doing different things. So they were the group of people. Got involved in the board, and I started working on a history of Moffat County, which was just a pictorial history of Moffat County, which must have been done in '86. So I was working on photographs. It was my volunteer project.
Uh-huh.
The commissioners had agreed to pay for the expenses of printing the little book. It's still around. It's sort of hard to find, and it's not very well printed. The style, the way they printed photographs and stuff in those at a small print shop in Craig wasn't necessarily the best.
Right.
But so that was '86 that I was working on that project, and so I volunteered my time. Louise Miller died that year, like in July, during that project, and so that changed the thing. Craig had been going through a substantial, increase in population in the '80s, 70s and '80s, but the bust had almost stopped. So there was a guy in town by the name of Jan Roth. He was a local taxidermist, and he came to the commissioners with the idea of creating a museum that would have been basically a wildlife museum, and it was going to be housed Today, it's the old county shop buildings, which had been almost abandoned at the time on East Victory Way, and now it's where the Steamboat Transit Authority's building for the buses that go to and from Steamboat. They built that on the same site. Anyway, that was going to be a wildlife museum, so he got started on the plans for that. Well, it came up in 87, 88, right at the bottom of the bust. And the community had a sort of a near riot over the concept that the county was going to spend a lot of money on a wildlife museum. Didn't come off well at all, so it went down in flames, actually, with the idea, and the board was sort of stuck in the middle of the whole thing. So in 89 or so, probably by the end of 88, he resigned. So he was in there at the most for a year and a half, 2 years. And so along came the fact that they needed that space in the courthouse for expansion, because the original museum, this is going to overlap a lot, were 4 rooms that were in the original portion of that courthouse, and the centerpiece that had started in 64. So they needed it. The county had owned this building since the 70s as well. They got it from the state of Colorado for $1.
Wow.
And with the consent or caveat on the deed that it remained for public purposes. They had to keep it up for public. And that'll come back into the story for the building later on. So here came along, and in 89 they came up with a plan to remodel this building, and they needed the space over there. And I showed up at a meeting or something, and so they actually just hired me on the spot one time.
Wow.
For the director piece of the museum in 89. So I worked under the same wage piece that Louise Miller had done for just a few months at the end of that year to put the budget in place, which probably started about August. So I got paid for half a day, whatever. It was fairly minor. The whole budget for the museum inside the courthouse was around $10,000, something like that. It wasn't a large budget at all. So anyway, that's what sort of started me as far as getting involved in the museum. So my first job was no staff at all. I told people that I was, and I think I was 33, close to that. I was the newest piece of office equipment in the whole museum. It had some funny stories, because Louise Miller was from the old school. She had raised a family during the Depression. And the things that you found in there were just hysterical. She actually saved little bitty pieces of pencils after they were used, and then she'd use the back side of adding machine tape and reuse it to the other side. Things that are just like, what? You're kidding me. And that's the kind. So nothing in the museum was new. The phone, which they got that was sitting, was one of those old, not the ones that crank, by the way, but it was a 50s phone that was just a black one that sat on the top. And the receiver was so heavy that if you'd swung it, you could have hurt somebody with it. And they were still paying the monthly rental fee on it through AT&T or whatever they had set. Because you didn't buy in those days, you didn't own your phones yet. You didn't rent them. You had to rent them from AT&T or Mountain Vale or whoever. Nobody really owned a phone until after that. So we actually had to ship it up. I wouldn't mind keeping it for the museum. You had to pack it up and ship it back to whatever, because by then the phone stores were gone. They'd got, that transition had happened, and you were too late.
Right.
So anyway, the biggest part of my job for that first few time frames were to try to get the museum moved from that spot over to here and remodel this building at a time. It was really a hectic, crazy time, frankly. I probably did a lot of things that I didn't know I could do. And probably a number of things I shouldn't have, as far as the way the county was organized. I didn't know any better.
Right.
As far as contracts and things like that. So, started full-time January 1990. And we opened up over here with very few exhibits in place and things. We opened up on Memorial Day 1991. There'd be quite a few other changes that happened. So I've been full-time since then, and they still pay me to have fun most days, so I stay. There's a few things that I don't like doing, but those are budgets, which we just sort of got done with. But this year had a little time involved with that, too. So maybe, would it be a good time to go back at this point and talk about the beginnings of that museum?
Yeah, that's
just sort of be a backward caveat to go back.
Yeah,
just a little dab. and then maybe we can just go forward from
Okay.
that. So it's about 1961, somewhere around there. They had a local rancher out north. And actually, I don't know that he was a rancher, but he was building a house outside of town on like 5 acres.
Uh-huh.
He was busy digging a hand-dug well from the old school as well.
Right.
And he came down onto some mammoth tusks. Now, I want to say that I could be wrong, because it could have been a mammoth tusk or it could be a mastodon, and to be honest, right off the bat, I'd have to go back and do the research.
Right.
Anyway, he couldn't figure out what to do about that, and so the community got really on board about trying to do something with that. They ended up with talking to the field house down in Vernal, Utah, and their doctors, and it was a husband and wife. The last name was Unterman,
Uh-huh.
or very similar to that. So they came up and did the excavation of those tusks. And a number of people in town thought, man, they needed a place in town where something like that could survive here versus just being shipped off to Utah
Right.
to another place. So that actually got sort of some discussions. And a year or two ago, Louise Miller's son passed away. And all of her stuff had gotten stored in an agricultural building and things, and in really poor condition. He didn't take care of anything like that. They had
Uh-huh.
moved out of the ranch house within just a short period after she died in '86. But here were the letters, actually, and the photographs of those tusks, and the letters back from Unterman's, and showing that she was really interested
Right.
in getting something going. So it's sort of like, okay, that fit with what I had read in the newspapers.
Uh-huh.
Realizing I wasn't old enough to be involved. So they got started then in '64. They had built a new courthouse over here that surrounded the old portion in '63. So the new courthouse almost, I'd like to say the old courthouse, which was 4 floors originally, a cut stone building,
Mhm.
was sort of abandoned inside the new courthouse. It's
Okay.
curious looking back why in the world they did it that way. The old building was really a cool looking building architecturally,
Right.
and it's like, why did they have to do that? But
Right.
it was the 60s view of urban renewal, I guess. But they didn't even tear it down. So they started working in '64 and went to the county commissioners and asked for that main level, except they always removed one walk-in vault that came in that was used by the clerk and recorders. They had control of that whole main floor. So it was 4 rooms, a couple of vaults, and so they started putting it together with volunteer. Louise was one of them, but there was a guy, Roger Johnson, was a local contractor,
Uh-huh.
and he was really important in the fact that they put the cases together. Because again, except for maybe buying a little bit of supplies, and maybe the county took care of, the lights and the heat because they were inside the building, they didn't have any funds. And so there were like 5 or 6 of them appointed. Louis Wyman, actually, that has the Wyman Museum, was actually on that original board
Okay.
that they appointed in '64. I don't know that he stayed on it very long. And then there was a group of people that were really into rock. They were rock hounds.
Right.
And there was a group of those people that involved. So one whole room was more minerals and rocks and different things like that.
Okay.
That's far too simplistic. I wish I could remember the details. We actually have somewhere, if anybody's ever doing this, we actually took a video of the whole museum
Mhm.
before we moved the old one. So somewhere there's VHS footage out there that probably
Oh.
needs to be converted that shows that old museum, how's it looked, because
Mhm.
you couldn't tell that by the way it looks now. So they did that. So in '68, the museum was ready to open up to public.
Okay.
And so what they did was, one room was sort of pioneer room and had like household goods.
Uh-huh.
And they devoted it sort of like along, just display cases along the walls that had everything was done really primitively.
Right.
And then one in the middle in one room, and then on the other side they had cameras, and they reused stuff out of the old courthouse to do it. And then one room was a work room and an anti-type room. So they had, except for storage piles, which were large, they had everything they had out on exhibit. Things didn't get changed very often. It was pretty rare looking back. A lot of those cases that were done in '68 were still in place when I took everything apart in '90 and '91 and moved it.
Wow.
So they were still, and it was basically unmanned, and it was inside a building that was open. So people could just go in and look around the room. And they had a sort of a sign-in guest register. Problem with that is it was right at the bottom of the staircase that went to the courtrooms.
Oh.
And a lot of people aren't happy when they come out of court. I don't know if if they've been charged with certain things.
Right.
And so they would express the kind of things they were feeling on that guest book, which weren't really great sometimes.
Wow.
So it was an unread. It was not fun to read what they put in there. I always thought that was. So I don't know how many people would end up being in there over time. Louise and the two people that were sort of helping her, which also served on the board. I need to mention that. I got to make a note here on a couple of people's names while I mention that. They would just mainly accession photographs and the items that people would bring in. And
Right.
to be honest, those amount of items were fairly insignificant most years. And the piles of work, stretched back years. And sometimes I think we're in the same boat now, and then how far we're behind. We did have the one thing that was neat, Louise did, she was a meticulous person for detail. I've never met anybody like her. And when we went through a lot of her stuff, when they were cleaning out the ag building after her son died, she would catalog and categorize everything.
Right.
Her kids' school records, because she raised 5 kids. She kept everything organized. And how did she do that? With a little old manual typewriter. And she smoked like a chimney, by the way. The museum was not non-smoking, because it had a yellow film. The other part I got a kick out of it, she was an unbelievably strong Republican. So, you aren't supposed to be running political Democrat, Republican inside of a government building.
Right.
Especially on election day.
Right.
Well, the museum was sort of Republican central headquarters on election days. Because she would go in and she would be making all these phone calls, to different people about, making sure that different people were calling to see if somebody had gone to the polls and voted. And I still smile about it, thinking, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so she sort of, she was just an unbelievably unique person. But she did do the research to set up the accession policy piece. And when we redesigned everything and moved over here, actually her process worked pretty good. I mean, we didn't change it. We left it alone. And so, except for changing a point, it'll get to be a problem in a new millennium, but I'm not going to worry out 1,000 years if we're around.
Right.
But we use that same series number for everything. A lot of small museums, when somebody starts to get them organized a little bit, have to go back and re-examine everything because nobody kept track of where it was.
Right.
Most all of our stuff has an accession number on it, so you know the donor, you know if it was loaned, you knew if it was done. She was so impressive on that kind of stuff that we didn't have to rebuild that system. They did take a lot of things on loan, so I spent my first. The other thing that happened in '90 was because of the economy and what had happened with the big energy producers pulled out of parachute. The third unit out here at the power plant was designed to produce the power that they needed for the oil show down on the Colorado and Piceance. Well, it cut, those big companies disappeared on what they called, I think, Black Monday, and went away. So Colorado Ute went bankrupt. So they didn't pay their property taxes in '90. So we didn't have time to start this project over here. So one of the things I did was go update loan forms and check with the people if they wanted it back after, how long? 90, after 20-some years.
Right.
Or if they wanted to donate it. And then I also was involved in, if you go to Moffat County, the courthouse, each office has the photographs of the elected officials, be it clerk or recorder, assessor and treasurer. I went around and did the research to find the people, the families that had the photographs for those people, and they sort of completed that project. So I did that kind of stuff.
Wow.
because we couldn't actually get started over here because we didn't have the money. In the process, we were going to use an architect by the name of Chamberlain out of Grand Junction, really nice guy. He had the idea on this building that we were going to do, you guys have been in lots of new museums, I assume, but the ceilings are black, you know, and everything. It's all about the exhibits, which is important, but we sort of had the idea that we'd like the building to be part of the exhibit as well, and sort of to show that. So we didn't have the money, so we ended up sort of just subcontracting out to people that did the work on the building, be it elevators or be it electrical or be it finishing. And that sort of happened independently without an architect behind it.
Right.
But like I said, I still like the project because his idea was to put the elevator shaft, which is, you know, come stand down here where the ramp was already done. We should go back into the history of the building a little bit too, I guess. Anyway, he was going to put it right in the front where you come into the front of the room, so that would have been broken, so you wouldn't see the mural or anything.
Oh, right.
So it was a completely different. Of course, the mural at the time was covered up because the National Guard had about 1960, because the Guard built the building in 22. It was a state of Colorado structure done by an architect, Huddard, that did a number of other ones just like it around the state of Colorado. So it was a public building, so they were designed for public use, and that could be dances, it could be funerals, it could be boxing, you name it, as well as a drill hall. And so where we're sitting in the basement down here, which we use sort of for a conference meeting room, was actually a full-fledged swimming pool that was 8 foot deep. You know,
Oh,
right?
wow.
And you can still feel the ridges in the floor with your foot as you walk, like they put on the edge of pools. So they'd covered that up. Their problem was, in the design, was that they didn't have good fans to take out humidity in the 20s. So it started buckling the floor on the main drill hall. So and also they put cold water into the boiler to heat it, and cracked the boiler. So the swimming pool didn't act very well. And it's amazing because it had sub windows in it, like garden level windows. Even into the munitions room. And, you know, in the 2013, you wouldn't put a window into your munitions room, you know,
Right.
for security purposes. It just wouldn't make it. So those doors were actually barred and things. So it got used for almost everything in town, but huge amounts of dances and community type things. When they built it, then it was Craig's gymnasium, because the schools didn't have gymnasiums until the 30s. So for basketball, they'd run down here, and the bathrooms were set up, and they were on both sides, not just where the bathrooms are now. They were back here for a locker room for the kids to shower. And for basketball, they'd play it here. For football, they'd come and change and then run out to where the fairgrounds were at. So they used it for that purpose.
Pretty decent little run.
And then graduation was held on the stage until 36 when they got those done. You name it, and they were probably doing the stage plays, you know, would have been done. The Kiwanis play, which is sort of a community hallmark, started in like 46, 47. The first few theater productions were on the stage up here. Be all that said, then around 1960, the Guard sealed off the stage and made that whole back an apartment piece.
Okay.
And that's just what we just now are finishing the remodel on, to change that where it's more usable space. Because from then on, there was a caretaker in the building that would live in here and make sure everything was being taken care of. So the Guard had somebody within the Guard until that. And then in 75, give or take a few years, the Guard, like we were talking about, gave it over to the county. And so the basement was used for Horizons for the handicapped. And that's why the ramp got put into it, so that they could get people up and down out of there. Upstairs was used for the Mickey, which was the Moffat County Youth Organization. So kids would have like pinballs. For years, even before that, they used the main floor for roller skating. That kind of was mainly an activities type structure. The kids were still having the junior high dances in it when we started in 90, 91. And some of the things they'd like to do, this whole system was still hot water heat. And like if you unscrew those, have you ever lived in a building or worked in a building that was steam heated? You could undo the regulator pieces, and so one day they came in and found that, you know, the steam had blown all over the stairs all night. Sort of hard on exhibit concepts. And the pipes were also, how old? 70 years old, so they were getting a little shot. So we had to completely change the heating systems and stuff out, so that it was a little more regulated environment for a museum. So, you know, each stage had to update the electrical, which was easy in one sense, because the lights were put into conduit, but you had to run conduit. We had to do the walls down in the basement, you know, fur them out and insulate them.
Right.
You name it. Every stage of the whole thing had to be sort of updated for practical purposes. And probably 20-some years later needs some of it again. But that, you know, the elevator got put in at the time. Upstairs, around the balcony area, was a really low metal 2 bars, which didn't meet any of the safety issues for AD, not that. AD, access, because you could fall over them. Kids could fall out of them.
Oh.
And in the old days, for the basketball, the cheerleaders actually had stood up there. And one of the young guys, as an old man, came back and said one of the things that they do would dare, the kids in high school would dare each other to get on the bar and swing down and jump to the main floor. That was just what they would dare each other to do. You know, and they said in most cases it worked fine, except the guy that broke his leg when he hit the floor. You know, so it was sort of an interesting break. But again, the building got used so much for so many different purposes. Bill Mackin loves to tell stories about it, but it was true. You'd have people come into the building and say, well, they met their spouse here at a dance. And there was no main door out the back because of the apartment, so the only door we had to put in the exit doors, which they had never had when they had hundreds of people in here. But it was known for its fights and sometimes brawls outside. But I think most of the time it was pretty well used through that whole purpose. So again, we opened in '91, and we've worked on military history because of the Guard history with it, and like this unit was what's the right word? Activated in 1940, well before Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
So this unit, it's the 157th, which was part of the 45th Division, saw all sorts of duty in North Africa, in Europe, and they were even part of the liberation of, the 45th was involved when they actually went in and invaded Germany. And I think it was the one that actually liberated Dachau, the concentration camp, which is outside of Munich. So one of the things that we have in the exhibit was interesting because, let me get his first name right. I'm going to have trouble with his first name. His last name's Hamilton, and he's from the little community. His grandparents homesteaded one of those places at Hamilton. He went into the Guard and was involved in that, but he was very good at clerical stuff, so he usually wasn't on the front lines. So his widow, because he's only been gone about 3-4 years, and his widow gave us huge amounts of photographs, but also some of the journals when they were coming on shore in Italy and different things. So he was actually in Munich, and he sent his folks home this humongous, giant German flag, which actually hung on the side of one of the buildings in Munich. And I don't know if there's ever a way to figure out which it is, but it's far larger than this table.
Wow.
Because it's as wide, it's almost as wide as this table, and it's longer than this table. So it's something we want to do, something for a thing. It still gives me goosebumps when I see it. But it got sent, and then as part of that, later on, we had one of the newspaper reporters that wanted to know more about it. So I talked to Mrs. Hamilton. His name was Stanley, by the way, Hamilton.
Stanley Hamilton.
I talked to his wife, and she sent some more things that related to that flag and that. But to me, it sort of demonstrated the huge price that this local Guard made to that war effort in World War II. And then I also knew a guy by the name of Vern Inman. He was our mailman when I was a kid. And he had served as, I'm not going to be good at military, he was a major or a captain, what his rank was, but he was an officer here for years because he had gone in and been captured, and I wish I knew the details of where, but his wife always spoiled him. He could eat whatever he wanted, she would tell him, because he had almost starved to death in the concentration camps after he was captured in Europe. And she was never going to let him go hungry again. But there was a number of people that had been involved in the Guard that had been prisoners of war, and so this building sort of represented that kind of sacrifice, I think, to the community. At least we've tried to do that. We did an exhibit on military through the time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and just did uniforms and tried to sort of express that interest. One of the flags up on the wall right now is actually on loan from a guy that was in the Gulf when the Gulf War started, and it was on one of the big...
You're 91?
In 91, and it was the one flying on the aircraft carrier that day that they didn't discuss, and so it's up on the one that's sort of tattered, and it's the flag that was on, and I wish I could tell you which carrier, but I'd have to look it up. So we've tried not to ignore that history part of the military part of it. Right now you don't see it. We used to have a sign that said up there, the National Guard meets here tonight, because we found that underneath the floor when we did the renovations. So we found a few cool things along with the renovations.
Right.
But the museum has been mainly still, the board is a volunteer board. It functions as purely that, and they've been amazing group of people over time. Marie Shepard was one of the ones I was going to mention. So she's a sister-in-law to Al Shepard that you guys interviewed. And Jim Shepard, her husband's still alive, but he spends most of his time in Arizona now. And I guess he still golfs a lot at 90 plus.
Oh, wow.
He's still on the golf course, still very active. But she had gotten involved, and there's a number of the people that I'm not going to mention that are really paramount to the organization that are in that group. Delane Voloshin has been on it. She was the one that was the new face on the board when I was doing that research back in the 80s. And these ladies, you could tell, growled when they saw somebody new show up. And she was not really appreciated for any of her ideas, I'll have you know. None of them were well received by that group. And they just weren't. Yeah. But then in another one, Barbara Baker, I don't know if you've met her. She was the clerk and recorder at the time and was extremely well-versed at accomplishing certain things politically. And I've always given her credit. I don't know if she's going to like me saying it in public, but anyway, credit for the fact that the museum was able to transition from just a few rooms in the courthouse to over here. She was probably one of the central piece. And again, the commissioners at the time were really agreeable to that too.
Was that Dean?
He might have been at that time. I'd have to look at their names, and it's like I've worked for 20-some commissioners now, and they have a tendency to, I remember them individually, but specifically in a group, they're hard to put together as a group. I know Tom Lefevre was in there. Tom Mathers, who's back as a county commissioner, was actually a county commissioner at the time I was hired as well. So you could say I've been involved with longer, and he's actually our ex officio member from the county commissioners, by the way, they work their boards. And anyway, he was heavily involved in that too. But and then a little bit, I suppose I wanted to mention some of the people involved. So Wilma Cosgrove, and it would be fun just to do a story on her herself, because she was sort of new to this project when she first started at the old one. She had the driest sense of humor of probably anybody I ever met. And she had so many little sayings that she had over a century. She wasn't ancient at the time. She was probably 65 to 70 at the time. And she'd come up with statements like, yeah, water does flow uphill towards money. And she she talked about working in the Depression and that you didn't even get up to go to the bathroom because you could be replaced before you got back.
Oh.
Because everybody needed a job so bad. So she was just always talking. She came with her husband to Craig, and she said she was really hoping to go to someplace really cool on her honeymoon because they must have gotten married in 39 or 40. And his first wife, I think, had died, and so she had a couple of, at least one, stepson. And instead of going to a fancy place, she said, I came to Craig for my honeymoon. And she said it in a real, like, oh, such a sad, like, look where I ended up. So the hotel hadn't gone extremely well because she said they built it 2 years too soon before the Rangeley oil field started booming during World War II and things. So they lost it and actually couldn't do that. So she'd worked different places. And her daughter actually came down with polio during that period when they had a lot of people coming down with polio in the 40s as a young child. So she had been in Salt Lake, and the marriage had broken up, and she came back here and worked different jobs, extremely talented, extremely agreeable and happy. She would pick up the phone no matter when you called her, no matter how sick she was. She'd call it up with this voice that thought, wow, like she was really glad to talk to whoever this was.
Yeah.
So she was a really great person to have. Alice Robinson had been the director of the Chamber of Commerce for a long time and had recently transitioned out of that position. And I think she liked to do that. She wasn't always the most open person in the world. So I don't think she liked somebody asking her to do anything different. And so for that first year or so, she didn't like me being around, let's be honest. And so she pretty much would do exactly the opposite of whatever I asked. Mm-hmm. That was how that worked. And she didn't like me too well on that. But I don't think it was personal, really. And it's just where she was at. And her husband got quite ill soon after that and passed away, so she quit working at the museum at that time. And as we transitioned into this building, Frances Roost was the lady that we hired to paint the mural. And she had never painted anything that big. And behind that was a guy by the name of Bernie Rose, who was a local artist guy. He'd come to Craig during the construction of the power plant, so he was an iron worker, I think is the right trade that he had come for. He'd grown up in Detroit and been involved in there, but I think he was also down in Gunnison and different, but he'd come up here to work and had stayed and gotten really involved in the community, was always looking for public art type things, and he really helped us do a lot of sort of handyman stuff around the museum at the time. And so he's the one that had found Frances. So Frances, after she started that, well, frankly, we needed somebody else to do exhibits and cataloging and all that kind of organization. So Frances got that job and was probably full-time by like sometime around the time we opened. By 91, 92, she was full-time here. So she stayed in that position until her health was a little bit worse. She had, I want to say, COPD would be a term for it now, and wasn't able to work as much. So she came back and worked part-time for us after this, but somewhere around 95, 96, Glenda Cooper had grown up in Craig as well. Her dad was, I'm going to have to come back and get his name, but he's the guy that was the shoe shop, Hal Jones, and it was the two-story building on the east side of Yampa down here, probably somewhere around 572 or so, but anyway, he was in there, and they had their house was upstairs.
Oh, right.
And she had worked for a number of years at the courthouse in the treasurer's office, and it was a good time for her to find another job. So she started, and she was really good about getting some record stuff updated. Frances really did a lot of things as far as getting the museum organized in one layer. Glenda did it in another layer as far as some computerization type things. Nothing compared to where we're at now. But she certainly got us on that particular track. One of her stories about this building was the fact that a local group of youth, somewhere in the late teens, early 20s, had broken into the dynamite storage area. Because Seabitz, I don't know if you've heard that story.
Yeah, but I'd like to hear it again.
So Seabitz was just in this block where there's missing stuff in here in the park. But they had their dynamite stored out north of town. And I think there was another hardware thing, so if I'm wrong, again, it was before I was too young. So somewhere around 63, 4, somewhere in that period, they'd gotten the dynamite, and then they proceeded to set it off in different places around town. In front of the post office, in front of the National Guard Armory, in front of some other gutter places around town. So they did some serious time for that particular activity that night. So the one guy, maybe we don't need to mention their names since I can't pull it up in my head real fast today either. He actually went and did time in Canyon City, and I think one other guy did too. And maybe a couple of them got probation. But Glenda, being across the street, remembers that the impact of that almost blew him out of bed. And so the original doors on this building are like the interior set, but they were destroyed in that dynamite blast.
Wow.
As well as if you look up above the entrance door, it's plywood instead of plaster, and that's because the explosion destroyed the plaster. So again, National Guard armories aren't good things to dynamite.
Right.
If you really want to value your freedom much, and realizing the back still had, and by the way, they sealed those basement windows up years ago because they were good places to leak water through. And we still have the same problem on the north of the water level will get in the ground level behind us, that we have water running here on the north side of this basement.
Right.
It's another issue to fix. But anyway, Glenda, I went back to that story. She had remembered the building for years because of that. So she grew up sort of downtown. She was a neat lady. And so after she had retired, they lost their son in a real tragic accident, right? Their youngest boy, after he graduated. He and some friends were just hiking in Lily Park, Deer Lodge Park, and had hiked into the canyons and were just pushing off boulders. And he had only been graduated maybe a month, 6 weeks. And when he pushed it, he went with it. So he went over the edge with it. And so so that was huge for that family, and really took a lot out of them. And so she retired probably a year or two later after doing that, and they were able to, she and her husband, Butch was actually, her husband was the superintendent for Road and Bridge for Moffat County for a long time. So, but she still was involved in the museum, still had come back and was on the museum board, and then came down last year real quickly, came down with pancreatic cancer. So she probably died like late November, something like that. And she was only mid-60s, something like that.
Wow.
Pancreatic cancer is a quick, painful, particular ailment for it. So after that, giving it a take in about 1999 or so, 98, 99, Jan Gerber had worked with Rita Gass for years, and she had been, then it had become Atmos Energy, and so they had transferred her down to a call center, giving some of her history away down in Amarillo, I think, and was looking for a way to get back home. So anyway, she's been the assistant director, so the other full-time person since then, has been putting up with me and us since then, because she's still here. So, we've done a huge amount of changes. Mary Pat probably started a couple of years before she came, so she started somewhere around 96. Her oral history will tell that better than what I'm going to remember. So she came in with this funny little statement that she did, because she was going to do a lot of our cataloging, which is that process of just moving something from when they give it to you, and they're just a name on a sheet, to actually putting numbers on it and putting it into the system to where you can tell what it is and where it came from.
Right.
But she said, I just don't want to do this if I'm bored, because the last job I was in, I was bored, and I just don't want to be that. Well, she hasn't gotten done yet.
Right.
She hasn't gotten caught up yet, so I think she's safe on that particular particular call. So they did. One of the huge things that's happened that Jan, I think, is working hard on to get started before she retires is to get that cataloging system past perfect to where, you've got it digitally stored, off-site, imaged, and that's had huge movements forward over the last few years. Mary Pat's starting it, and she continually working on it. But through that whole process, we've had continually more people coming all the time, more donations all the time. Right. So it just puts a lot of pressure on actually accomplishing what you want to.
Right.
And I think everything worked in like about 2004. The county had some really progressive commissioners that had spent a lot of money. Let's just leave it at that. And so the county's fund balance fell to probably scary proportions, to where it was getting questionable whether they might even make payroll or something. So the new group of commissioners came in and everything. So what happened in about 4 was the fact that we lost all of our part-time people that year. And so everybody got laid off with the janitor, which we've never replaced yet. We probably need to. So the staff takes care of those issues. But we had an amazing janitor as well at the time that did that. So she came, so that happened. And so like that year, Jan and I were sort of here by ourselves, trying some different things just to try to make things work. And gradually, through some other fundraising issues that we had been successful in doing, we had the money to help, get some people in to do the part-time staff thing again. Another huge issue that happened that I haven't mentioned yet is Bill Mackin and the Cowboy Gunfighter collection. I had met Bill in the old museum, and we had an exhibit in there, a small one. Because when I say an exhibit in the old museum, that means that it probably took up about 6 feet of space in a cat on the wall behind glass. We left all the glass pretty much with it at the old. I think there's still a pile of glass over in the storage at courthouse from the museum. Wow. That we didn't need. He had come in and told me, he said, well, that could be a model 1876 Winchester or something like that. No, get it right. He said that Winchester could have been found on the battleground over in Meeker. But considering it's an 1886 Winchester, it certainly wasn't involved in the massacre, the battle that happened in 1879.
Right. That
was our first discussion. He was pointing out the differences in how we made the exhibit was wrong. And I sort of apologized for it, probably too much. But I told him about the museum and what we were planning on doing. So that got started. He had lived in Meeker. He was looking for a place for his collection upstairs. So we didn't get it done. And to be honest, we weren't happy with each other quite often. Because we had different goals in mind. His was to protect the collection. Mine was to sort of get the museum going, and I should have done better on the others, but he had to move out of his house in Meeker. So one area we really got along poorly on one day was that in a gun safe in the basement down here, and we had to carpet the floors, was a lot of those guns. Well, we moved them, which you shouldn't do, because they could have gotten marred or scratched, and they were in great condition. So Frances was the mediator that kept us together, Ruth, that time, because she was good at doing that, because neither one of us liked each other very well. So in '92, it was Memorial Day, we actually got the Cowboy Gunfighter collection opened up there. So he basically leased it at no cost to the county. We'd pay for the insurance on it every year, and we also helped him out a little bit on wage issues a little bit when he had retired from mental health to get through some things. And then by the late 90s, he was looking at retiring for full-fledged and needing to liquidate the collection. That was basically his retirement plan. And so we came up with several different ideas. It turned out to be sort of a catastrophe in some ways. It worked out okay to actually purchase the collection. So gradually it had increased in value substantially. Each year we had to have it appraised. And it just kept growing, because I think when we started in on it, it was probably $300,000 or something. Before we were started, it was $700 and some thousand. It had been just really jumping every year. And so we came up with a fundraising idea that we hired a company by the name of Jackson and Associates to come in raise the funds to actually purchase it within that. So there was a lot of things done by the commissioners, a lot of things done by the community, but the funds didn't come in like they were expected. We'll just leave that. We actually created a foundation to help fund the museum. That didn't come off like it was supposed to done either. So that was a really sort of a difficult time in that transition period to pick that up. So by 2000, I guess everything was sort of entered in the fact that the museum owned the cowboy collection lock, stock, and barrel. There was some indebtedness on its behalf by the community foundation, it's still there. But again, the taxpayers and the museum own it, and the control rests here with it. So if anything ever, is ever done with it, it's the taxpayers that own it, as the whole museum, which I didn't go. The building's owned by Moffat County. The staff is paid by Moffat County, and the collection's owned by Moffat County. So, not that they'd go and sell that, but that's just the way it is. Each museum's weird and a little bit similar, and I think each one's different depending on how they were formed.
Right.
Just the way they ended up doing this particular one. And they again, taking care of the insurance helps, because that's not a huge issue for Moffat County with the huge scope of what they have to do for insurance, where if it was a private enterprise, it'd be pretty substantial.
Right.
So I think the other thing, and that continues to be a part that we should probably do more for, is the cowboy collection. It's been sort of our hook, our attention getter. It's the stuff that's, and the value, the last appraisal, even after the recession piece, it was considerably more than what we paid for it. So, it had gone up $200,000 or $300,000 from the other time. Bill still volunteers here, and I have to admit I haven't studied it up as much because we've got sort of an expert here, and it needs to have somebody that's more of a curatorial person, so there's a number of areas that we need to go in the future. And then I guess the other piece that I wanted to talk about was that mineral program.
Right.
That started in '98, give or take, same time as the fundraiser for Bill's collection was going on, because we weren't really doing as well as it appeared that we needed to. And we had used minerals to find people over time, and meaning the fact that if your grandmother homesteaded a place, or your grandfather, that lots of times what went with the family was the mineral, even though they'd sold the surface. It's been law, started by the federal government, 100 years ago, that they reserved like the coal to start with, and then later on the federal government during Homestead would reserve the oil and the gas. And there were different parts of that would reserve different things, but by 28 they reserved everything, so the homesteader would only get the surface and nothing of the subsurface estate that the minerals are. So anyway, we'd found people like that before, and we'd had one couple ask about, gee, if in our estate planning, would you guys ever be interested in keeping them? So we'd done a little bit of research. And then it came along a lady that I caught, and her grandmother had homesteaded on an area called South Fork of the Williams Fork, and it's actually in Rio Blanco County. And her mother was the first girl born in Craig, after Craig was started in '89. She was born about 1890, I think, and had lived here. So she inherited these through her family. And when I caught up with her, because I was trying to talk to her, I wanted to find out some things about the family, she said, would you take these minerals? And so that started in '98. And I got to talk to her several times before she passed away, and told her she was responsible for starting something that was just amazing. So she and then her brother's wife, he had passed away already, were the first ones to donate that. So that started in '98, and we actually would send out letters for a number of years about people that were willing to do that. So over time, probably from that period until 5 years, the acquisition period was mainly at. That we ended up owning, it was over 100 people that had donated things to the museum, wow. And it's over 10,000 mineral acres. So you can have that, and then so it was a substantial amount of money. The first few years, we leased something. I think the first stuff we leased was in like '99, and the oil and gas guy that was leasing it was talking about how ridiculous we were asking for whatever that dollar figure was, which was only $25 or $35 or whatever, and the royalty that you can negotiate. the county had lost some of their staff that was really good. Frankly, Barbara Baker, and some of those were really good. She had managed clerk and recorder at one time in Moffat County. They still do a lot. They did a lot more 20, 30 years ago as far as deposits. She oversaw the mineral she did leasing. She did, you name it. So they had lost that group of people just through new people being elected. Not that they weren't good at doing their things. So along came another bunch of commissioners. It was the ones that cut a lot. Darrell Steele was one of them that was involved in doing that, but he had a good sense for doing that. So the mineral guy, Jeff Comstock, the natural resource director, got involved in that. So that's been a team effort ever since then, which helps the county, which helps the museum. And and here a company by the name of Beartooth was the first company to drill on some museum minerals. And I think the check that we got for royalties were, probably a couple $100, but probably $50 to $100 a month, something like that was what that early period was. So they hadn't brought in a huge chunk of money, but then 4 years ago, they had a formation called Niobrara Formation, which is a shale, similar, that they started leasing. So the lease play got to be substantial. And we leased a significant amount of mineral acreage that year out of what our total was. So the report was. So it brought in almost $900,000 that 1 year. And it's getting a little, I think that's 2010. So there were, but again, it was working that hand in glove issue with the counties to where they put together a really good lease. They're protected. There's a lot of nuances involved in it. So I think it's helped the county people that had minerals as well to maybe sometimes have people they can contact and make better deals. It's not now that we're more in the exploration stage for the last several years. A lot of people have sort of struck out so far because Gulfport hasn't been, struck out could be the wrong word, not been as successful as they wanted. Gulfport hasn't, and now Shell's just announced, last week that they're going to look at an exit strategy. I think it's just in our paper here today. And so it's a very volatile, complicated little issue.
Yeah.
But it's enabled us, and right now we have a little program where 20% of the revenue that comes into the museum on the mineral program actually goes back to offset our operational part with the county. So we're subsidizing our own operations as well as being able to do other things. So some of the things we've done this year, because we've actually saved that money up from 2010, 11, and 12. And we had some others. So the renovations in the back of the building, none of the things that we're doing this year have actually come from taxpayer money. The renovation piece is all from mineral-related things. We are actually a repository for some artifacts that are dug up on state land board lands. Like when they do pipelines for gas things, a number of them have gone through the area by Maybell, north and south. We've actually taken some of those in and we store that. And so we actually got some money for doing that. That went towards this renovation project. The oral history program this year is funded from that particular project as well. And we're doing an exhibit right now on the Cosgrove, which is the old defunct hotel. But they had a big exhibit of Delano was an artist that did a lot of Western stuff. He was known as the artist of the Navajo. But he had an exhibit go up in the Cosgrove in '58, and it stayed until the mid-'70s. So we actually were able to purchase one of those paintings. It's going to be up in the exhibit area coming up here in the next month. We've been able to do that and acquisition things that most small museums are never able to do at this stage because of that mineral program. So I guess I see it as, I had a lady call just the other day, and her grandfather had donated the mineral interest to the museum 13, 14 years ago. And they had contacted him to try to catch up with his brother, who hadn't. And so she told me the kind of numbers that we were kicking around about what they were getting, and she was sort of, and it was large numbers for, the average person. And so I just could show her that, in fact, we do have a thing up that shows each donor up there on the wall when they come in. That also the exhibit people and the different things we're able to do because of what those people gave us.
Right.
So we're still trying to do that main thing the museum does, and that's to preserve history and to work on the education and to be a visitor resource. Those are things that everything we do, we try to tie into those core systems.
Right.
And, the museum mineral program has just given us the funds to be able to do that without the taxpayer being the one that, and it's almost been a win-win for everybody as far as the community and how they view it. It's been pretty fun to be part of that particular thing and to stay around long enough to see it work.
Yeah.
You know, lots of times you get to start something, but you don't always get to be the one to finish it.
Right.
Is that a good stopping spot?
That's a great
an hour.
spot.
I have a question, though,
Okay,
if you don't
please.
mind. Can you just talk about the process of writing the new book that you just released, the Early Craig?
The Early Craig one? That would be cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, I tried not to hit all those spots. So, Mary Pat had been involved in doing an Arcadia book up in Hayden, because she was the museum director at Hayden. I don't know if you've heard these stories from her. But Arcadia is not always the easiest company to deal with on the front side. I like their product. I like the way it looks. I like to do that because they're doing so many, they've got a fairly rigid time frame to work in, and then also a fairly tight thing that you have to drop all those into. So we had decided that we wanted to do our own sort of photographic history book, and so we had sort of said, no, we don't want to do that. So it had been a couple of years, and all of a sudden we had one of the county commissioners. To be honest, we had been fairly blunt about not wanting to do it 2 years ago. And so a county commissioner in Routt County was approached by Arcadia. So she went ahead and approached one of our county commissioners and the city council about doing the book. She was new. Didn't make me very happy, to be honest with you at the time, because it appeared that they were just going around, but it was a different situation. So politically, it appeared that it was a good time a year ago or so, I guess a year and a half ago, to actually do it, because we had the books. You know, we had the photographs. Lots of times, if you've studied Arcadia, they have other people write those. They aren't necessarily all. It was the museum that's the ones that are doing it. And so it took a long time to pull the pictures, and so we decided to do Early Craig over a period of time because Jan did a lot of the writing. She did all the scanning. She'd been working on scanning the photographs for a long time. And there's a specific way you have to scan them for Arcadia, but really when you look at the quality, they're good. They really are well done, and she's gotten to be really good at scanning things that sometimes aren't the best images. So it took a long time to sort and scan, and Mary Pat did a lot of the rewriting pieces. The different ones helped do other parts, and it was a fairly arduous, non-enjoyable project. And so along the boat, somewhere along the line, we dedicated it. Sorry.
That's all right.
We dedicated it to Glenda Cooper because we just heard about that, and she was okay with that. We asked her permission, and we wanted to acknowledge what she had sort of done. We thought that would be a fun thing to do, even though we knew that she wasn't going to get to be able to see it. But it recognized her input into that whole process.
Right.
So when it came out, it was sort of like, wow, it's finally done. So we thought it wasn't going to show up for a few weeks, and here they had a box of them over at the courthouse where I get my mail over there, and it's like, what are those? Why do you have something from Arcadia? And it was like, wow. So anyway, it turns out we had gotten an early release card from them. So I thought, well, that was different. So it was fun to see it finally done. But as usual, if you've done books, you find things that we wish you could have done different. So there were 2 images that got reversed. Those are the only, actually flipped, you know. So if you were looking at your shirt, you couldn't read it because it would be like in a mirror. So there were 2 images that happened to that I wish we hadn't had happen. And the other thing is, we had looked over it so many times, and we had even had Janet Bohart had volunteered to come in and read it as non-interested third party because it's hard to proofread your own stuff.
Yeah.
And she had made corrections. But we forgot, like, to put the photographers' names in a number of them. We had the information, but we forgot it.
Hmm.
You know, it's like there's a few things that if they redo a second edition, I want to at least get those photographs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and there's like, and then the order of the book was amazingly arduous, just to get the flow of the pictures the way you wanted them to go. Really? Why is that? So anyway, we had so many photographs. Most of the time you just do one, but we just did them up to 1929. So I guess there's still another one in the offing, technically, if we can ever get ourselves around to doing it, or somebody probably forces us.
Mhm.
And then we wanted to do one for Moffat County because, you know, we collect a lot of photographs around here.
Right.
And that's the other part. Our museum has a big collection of archival material. A lot of local history museums don't do that. They'll just have the artifacts, and the libraries will sort of have this. It's just how they evolve, I guess. And there'll be a historical society. But since the beginning, and it goes back to Louise Miller, she was big on research material.
Mhm.
So she would take anything that anybody would give her, you know. And so we've got some really amazing early county record stuff because of that.
Mhm.
And, unfortunately, I guess I and everybody else has continued that overflowing. But I do think we have an amazing group of photographs, historic photographs, and even current because of that project. So it was fun to do that. We've done several other books. Passing of the Old West was it was a serially done series back in the 50s. So C.A. Stoddard Sr. did it, and he would just talk about some things out of the old newspapers and put down the stories every week for a couple of years. He did. And so his son, and we had gotten that put into sort of a new format. I think we lost it once because of the change in formats. He said, well, what it'll take to get that published? And I said, well, I guess we need X number of dollars to do it. So he and his wife, so it's Chuck Stoddard, C.A. Stoddard Jr., and Joanne actually put the money up to do that book, with then all the funds that come back from that book go into a publishing fund we have. So we can actually do some more publishing. We didn't need to use that with Arcadia. We've done that with a Buster Brown book because Barbara Baker, that's on the board that we mentioned, her father was actually a young guy, played the part of Buster Brown. And we had his saddle as another guy up there, so it sort of tied. So we've got a Buster Brown exhibit. Part of it's down right now, but it's tied to that. So we've done another book. So we try to make our photos also available for other people that are doing publications. We have a formal cost process, but we usually don't use it. We think it's more important to get the images out there and the museum's name out there than it is to make the money off of them. So we haven't had to charge. We just haven't done that much. That was a long answer for your short question.
No, that was great.
But and that's what's happening this year. We took on probably too many projects, to be honest, and that's why I would have to, we can take this part out later, but apologize to you first and you that I haven't been involved in the thing as I should have. Because there's just so many things going on. We're doing a grave out on the Williams Fork. Again, our projects have a tendency to last years, if not decades.
Yeah.
This was a black couple that came and homesteaded in the 1880s, and she died in 87, we found out later. But I'd found the grave site and read the history piece, and my uncle showed it to me 15 plus years ago. And there was only one cedar post left that showed that there was a grave there. And but anyway, then later, after she died, he had remarried. That didn't work out well. He remarried a lady over from Georgetown, and she had kids, and it was just not good. And he had probably like tuberculosis type things, and couldn't really work much. And he had lung issues his whole life. So he actually went to the old soldiers' home and passed away in about 1903 over in Monte Vista. But those are the kind of amazing stories you get into. So I thought we'd never find any other clue on the date of this lady's, except for one. We only found one spot. And in research, you always find two or three. You always look for more than one source. And but if you can't find it, what do you do? We found one thing on census, and we found a little bit about Susan Davis. But here not long ago, and the lady, the Daughters of the American Revolution, helped us on the grave that the Wallahans did, that we actually ended up owning the site, the 20 by 20 area down there, which are another fun research project. But she'd seen where he was buried and found his records. Well, we asked for his military records because he was a veteran from the Civil War, and he was actually a major in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. So he was actually an officer. And he fought at one of the battles where very, very few of the black soldiers survived.
What was his name?
His name's Davis, and I'll have to get his name. He goes by I'll have to get his initials. For some reason, that's left my mind. I might come up with it before we finish talking about him. So his records were an unbelievable story to me, to talk about what slavery was like. And it's one of those goosebump things for me, because in there he would tell about where he was born and how he'd been sold to, he was born in Tennessee, I think Paris, Tennessee. He'd been sold to another family that was up the river. There's a guess on why he was sold too, because he was called mulatto and he wasn't that dark. So I have a guess on what happened about that, because I think that was fairly common. And he told the name of the family, and then he told the name of the doctor that he was actually owned by at the time he went into the Civil War. And because they said he wasn't really disabled during the war, apparently you could only receive a pension if you were disabled because of your service, not because of something you had prior to your service. So they kept trying to find out about these treatments. So you find out what the treatment was for what he had, and where he was sick, and so you find out where he met his wife in the hospital, I think, at the end of the war in Little Rock, Arkansas. So you find out her name, and they're finding out when they got married, when they moved, where they moved, and then when she died. So we found out in 2 ways and 2 different times. We found out she died in 87, not 88, which is no big deal, but it's still more correct. But anyway, it was interesting to see the kind of sacrifice that particular man put into his homestead, and to think that he was a slave and he'd gone through that, and I think at that time was fairly well received in Moffat County. It wasn't until later that the blacks would have had more trouble living here, until after the stuff that came out, the Ku Klux Klan stuff that comes out of the South, and that was huge in Colorado in the 20s. I mean, they basically sort of owned the State House for a year or 2, not very long, in the mid-20s. So every community had some impact, was somewhat impacted. Early on, you don't see that kind, and there was another black family that come. But his would have been totally unknown if it wasn't for those people sitting down and doing those interviews with him, trying to take his pension. But, amazingly enough, they preserved his story, which I think is really, we want to do more about that.
Yeah.
It's one of those things we want to do more than mine. So everything's ready to do they actually were going to use that site, and it's nothing against the oil company, because Sealy that owns it said, no, you aren't going to do it up there because there's a grave on it. It would have been one of those sites that they, would have been lost because they would have drilled an oil well upon it. So anyway, I think it sort of served its purpose to preserve the different kinds of people that have an impact on the community, which is what we try to do. It's not so one kind of what you really think. We don't all look alike, and we don't all come from the same backgrounds. And I hope we are trying to try to portray that. So that's just one of our projects this year.
Wow.
There's been billboards, and there's been a whole flock of other things that are involved in some of those kind of things that we try to do. Anything else, or is that more than enough?
No, that was really good.
That was great. Unless you have any other stories.
So one of the other things that we have done for a fundraising for the museum was a sponsor day type program, and that came about because of that 2004 I talked about, when the funding had been cut for our part-time staff. So somebody could, by paying $40 or a certain amount for the month, or maybe a month, and it was a larger, like $1,000, they could just sort of help sponsor enough for us to get our part-time help back. And that's something that helped sponsor Saturdays and things like that. So even though our funds have been in better situations, we've continued to do that. So that brings in like $10,000. So it's a different group of people that really sort of support the museum, and I didn't want to leave them out of that particular discussion.
Right.
So it helps us to sort of subsidize what we do on for a 6-day week, and so helping with the items being accessioned. And the other thing sort of wrapping up for the museum is the fact that we've been able to do what we've done because that county funding's been in place since 1990 to sort of carry that underneath piece as far as the operational for full-time staff and for utilities, and they take care of insurance. So that's given us a solid foundation for that. But the other piece is that there was a whole bunch of really generous donors. That might be given photographs, or it might be given something really small, or it might be really something big, that they've donated something to the museum that we couldn't have been what we are without those people's generosity. And the community as a whole is really generous, but there's always families that sometimes are willing to give you things, and then there's certainly some families that never would. That's just the way life works. And so I wanted to acknowledge, because there's hundreds of those families, so I won't mention them in particular, that we wouldn't have what we have if it wasn't for them on a regular basis or a one-time thing, giving us photographs or furniture or papers or you name it, that have given us a really solid foundation to work off of. And I think that's just a little bit of a wrap-up there.
Okay.